In this video, we're going to create this dirt ground material. Now, the setup is actually pretty simple, so we're just going to walk through each one of these nodes so that I can show you how this material was created. So here, let me just expand my graph view, and let's take a look at these nodes. So what I do when starting a material is I always start with the height and the normal to build up the overall surface. So here you can see that with my graph, I start all with grayscale data, and then finally towards the end I move to my color. Again, this is a more optimized way to work. As I mentioned in the optimization videos, we want to keep color as one of the last operations that we start to build up. Also, all of the grayscale data that we're going to be working with is used to build up the overall surface shape and detail through our normal, height, roughness, and ambient occlusion maps. When I start on a material, I'll first make a temporary material that I use as like a modeling material that allows me to better focus on the overall shape and details of the material. So let me show you how I do this. I'll start with the base material, and we've covered this in some of the previous videos, but I think it's important just to kind of showcase this again. So here, let's go over to the material preset. I'll set this to dielectric. And since I already have my outputs, what I'll do is just plug these guys in. But I'll start here with just the normal, roughness, ambient occlusion, and height. Because again, these are the grayscale values that I'm going to utilize to help me, again, build up that overall surface shape and detail. So let's just see what this is going to give me. Let me just plug in my maps real quickly here. So here's my roughness, and we'll plug this into the roughness. And here, let's just come down to where we have our our height, and finally our ambient occlusion. So now that I have this hooked up, let's just view this material in the 3D view. And so like I said, this just gives me kind of like this grayscale kind of modeling material that allows me to really focus in on the shape and the detail. As I'm starting to build up this detail, I'm feeding it here through this base material, and once I kind of have this overall surface detail in place, I'm then ready to start working on the overall colorization of the material itself. So here you can see that I have these rocks and pebbles scattered across the surface. And so here you can see that I started to create that using our rock shape. Now there's something I'd like to show about the rock shape because I made some changes, and I'm going to showcase what I did here. So notice here that we have this rock shape, and let's take a look at the parameters. I added this new variation mode here, and so here I get a shape like this that I'm calling the hard edges. So I get kind of like this hard edge and this kind of sloped off region here. And so if I switch this here to the softer edge, this is the rock that we created in the previous video. Notice the difference that we get. So here in this material, you can see that this kind of more rounded shape here is producing these types of rocks. And this is okay, but for the type of ground that I wanted to create, I wanted to just kind of have a bit more of a sharp edge here. So that's why I created this harder edges version of this. And so to me, this just looks, a bit more varied here in the surface and gives the rocks just a bit more character. And so like I said, let me just show you how I did this. It's actually quite simple. So let's just jump back over to our rock shape. And here I'll just zoom in on the 2D view, and it's in this section right here that I just added this this new shape. So here are the nodes that I used. Actually, here's a noise that I'm not using. Let's delete that guy. So yeah, what I did was I just started here with my polygon 2 to get basically this shape here. Notice that I'm at 8 sides. And then I run a levels on it here to make a sharper version of this. And then here I have a blend that's set to switch. And if we take a look at this opacity here, let me just go in, you can notice that this is where I'm starting with my pebble variation. So here you can see that I have this function that I created, and it was using the same technique that we covered in a previous video where I created a drop-down list with two options, soft edges being with a value of 0 and harder edges being with a value of 1, and I'm using this 0 and 1 basically as a toggle for my opacity setting. So here we have polygon 2, and here we have just a sharper version of that. And it's going to get, and which version gets output is going to be controlled by the user parameter in the drop-down list. So next, I take whatever shape it is, and I just do this kind of directional warp with this guy. Now notice here that I'm borrowing, again, this purlin noise that we had used earlier when we created our rock shape. Like I said in the optimization video, just try to reuse as many nodes as possible. So I'm using that same purlin noise, and so we just do a directional warp and we get this. And then here is another directional warp, and so here you can see that I'm just kind of using the input from the previous and also the intensity input from the previous warp just to get this kind of shape here. So next, I grabbed another shape here and I set this pattern to pyramid with a tiling of 1, and then here I used my transform. Again, this setup here, we've actually covered this in another video, but I'm just going to kind of just run through it again just as a refresher. So here's my transform, and you can see that I just rotated and moved it down so I can get kind of like a dark edge, and then move basically kind of this pyramid shape down just to offset the shape that I'm going to get. And then I'm taking this shape, and I'm blending them together with a min darken mode to get this rock here. Now here I do 2 levels. So the first level gives me this more rounded shape, and this is what I'm calling the softer edge rock. And this level gives me, you know, just a bit more intensity here. So this is going to be kind of more of like my harder shape. And so the version that we're going to pass through to this guy here, again, because I'm adding these levels, once again, I just copy and pasted the blend that I had here because I'm just trying to route between 2 different, just like I showed you here with the shapes. Again, we're just routing between 2 different level corrections here. And I just copy and pasted this blend. If we come into the empty function, it's using the exact same nodes here. So it's just, again, tying back to that same user parameter. And so we're just outputting this guy here. And again, borrowing just that noise. So in our previous video with our rock shape, we had this noise, and here we just kind of subtracted it here onto our shape, just doing the exact same thing again, borrowing that noise, processing it with the levels, and then here just multiplying it and dropping the opacity down just to get a little bit of noise into that. And then here finally we just plug in this shape. Now again, notice underneath opacity we have that empty function that we created before, which is going to show us our pebble mode. So either we're going to show this rock shape that we have, or we're going to show one of the variations of the pebble being either the soft or the hard edge shape. And so once I added that, I gave myself just a little bit of extra flexibility when I'm utilizing this rock shape here. So let's go back to dirt ground, and that's how we created this version here. And like I said, we got this drop down set to harder edges, so we get this shape. Now I wanted to be able to scatter this rock across the surface, and so what I use for this is just this node called Splatter. And Splatter is pretty basic, has a lot of controls, but you don't have the same flexibility that you have with using the tile random. But again, Splatter gives you a nice kind of, well, splatter or scattering effect of some type of shape. So it's good in this case. So here I'm just scattering or splattering the rock shape. Just ran through and adjusted my parameters until I get, you know, just something like this. It's actually pretty straightforward just to run through these guys. What I did though is, if you'll notice, I've got some rocks that are a size, and then we've got some really small ones, so I wanted to increase my variation of this. So I ran another splatter effect. This time, if we take a look here, let me see which one of these I changed here. Yeah, so here we have this zoom option, and it's set to 100, and then here on the splatter you can see that I just, you know, changed some of the variation and disorder, and then increased my zoom here, which makes these shapes a lot smaller. Actually, that's not right. What I changed was the grid number. So on the smaller pebbles, I just increased the grid number, which in turn makes more rocks and smaller in size. You could also use the zoom if you want, as you could just reverse it, so a larger zoom and a smaller zoom. But in this case, I used the grid number. So we've got like a very small version here. This is for the very small, kind of more pebble-like rocks, and this is for the larger rocks. And within these, they both have the size variation increased as well. And then here, I'm just using a max lighten to blend all this together. And so here is basically the height information we get for our pebbles. And that's being fed through a couple different nodes, and we'll discuss that here in just a bit. But for now, we know that we have, you know, this pebbles pattern here that we're using on our rock. So next up, once I had this, I wanted to actually start to create the surface of the ground itself. So again, thinking in terms of height and normal first, I'm working in grayscale data to start. I created this node network here of a bunch of noises to start to create my base pattern. And that base pattern, even though it's being used for height and normal, it's going to be colorized using the gradient node, as we'll discuss here in just a bit. So let's take a look at this node structure and how I started to just kind of build up my ground. So what I do is I just started with this moisture noise here, and I chose this one because I kind of like these kind of dark area ranges like this here. And so if you kind of look, it just gives you that feeling of kind of like, you know, variation in ground. So we have maybe, you know, kind of like a lower spot here in the ground. We've got this white area, maybe that's kind of like a little small dirt mound and so on. So I use the moisture noise. Then I grabbed a fractal sum again. This gives me a lot of kind of like high frequency detail. And then I'm just blending these two guys together. So notice my blending mode is set to multiply, and I'm just dropping the opacity here. So, you know, you can see the combination of these two. So we start with this, and then I grabbed another noise that we have called Dirt 4. And so that's what this guy looks like. Again, a bunch of noise. And I just ran it through some levels to really just kind of crunch the values to this guy. So you can see that, you know, we get a lot more kind of dark areas, basically just to kind of make the dirt noise a bit more sparse. So once we had these guys, I wanted to combine them with what I had created already. So we're going to combine this map here with this using this blend node. And here you can see that I've just set this to add linear dodge, opacity all the way at 1. So at this stage, this is what we start to get. And, you know, I always like to say that when you're building up, you know, different effects for procedural materials, variation is going to be the key. So following with that, here I added another noise. So this time I grabbed hold of this grunge map 13, and I chose this one because I liked that, you know, we had some of these lines like this, and this kind of gave me, you know, a little bit of a feel of some kind of maybe some water streaks. There's just a lot of variation in this map, and I wanted to be able to utilize that. So here we're going to take what we had previously. You know, we've got some values, but it's still pretty plain. So now we're really going to vary it up with a more high contrast dirt map. And so here is the result that we get. I'm using multiply with an opacity of 1. And so now I'm going to then come in and just take the output of this and process it with the levels. So here you can see that I basically just took my input white and just pulled it down just to, you know, get this more in a high tonal range. And now this is the map that we're going to take over to our color when we start to colorize this to create, you know, our color for our dirt ground. We'll cover that here in just a bit. So for now, I want to show you what I did for the roughness. So notice here that, you know, I have this map and this gray value. So like I said, I'm working my gray value. So here, I just came over, took this map, ran another levels here to get this as my roughness. So notice what I did here for this levels is I took the output black and just moved it, you know, really close to the output white, and that just lifts that tonal range of all the darks to get this, you know, more flat version here. So this is going to be a fairly rough surface, but I did want some dark areas in here where, you know, some moisture and things like that's collecting in the soil. I'm just outputting this here to my roughness. Now one thing I want to show here is if I select this levels node and I come over here to my base, notice that for my output format, I set this to absolute and 8 bits per channel so that I can force this roughness to be 8 bits per channel. Like I said in the optimization video, you want to be careful about, you know, which nodes and things like that are being processed at 16-bit. So like here I have this one set at 8-bit, but I actually probably may have fixed this upstream here a lot sooner. So let me just check this node. Yeah, here you can see I have this blend node, and these noises here, notice that they're operating at 16-bit internally, and we can't really change these on this output format. So if I select this guy and I were to set this to absolute 8-bit, it's still going to internally, it's still going to be working at 16-bit. So I had these 16-bit noises. I don't really need 16-bit here for, you know, what I'm doing here with creating my normal feeding grayscale value to my normal as well as my roughness. So on this node here, I set this output format to be 8-bit. So that's basically then forcing 8-bit down the rest of the processing, which again, in the case of what I'm using this data for, is going to be more optimized. So that's going to take care basically of, you know, the kind of detail, the grayscale detail values, what I'm going to be, you know, using for my surface attributes here, such as my, you know, height and bump and normal and so on. So we've discussed how we've created the roughness map. Let's take a look at the same map again, and then I feed that here to a normal mapper. So if we look at this again, remember I've set this here to 8-bit per channel. So then here I have our normal node. If you hit the space bar, you can find the normal node. It's right here, or you can see it here on the toolbar. And so I just feed this in, and here's the normal map information I get here. Let me just turn off the alpha transparency. And again, if we just kind of zoom in, you can see that, you know, I'm just creating this normal variation here. I'm trying to be careful. So notice my intensity, I've dropped this down. I want to be careful because there's a lot of high frequency noise in this. And I just, again, just be careful about just having this value set way too intense, because it's just, you know, it's not really good to have a lot of really super high frequency detail like that just in your normal map. So here we have our normal, and then I'm just going to combine this now. So like I said, I wanted to watch a lot of the high intensity values of this. And so what I decided to do was take my rocks and then take my ground and separate these two guys into two different normals so that I could combine them later. This allowed me to utilize a different intensity value here for the ground kind of detail versus for the rock. So notice here for the rock, I have a much higher intensity. Here for my ground, a much lower intensity, since this is so high frequency. And that's why I decided just to kind of break these two out, just so that I could have fine control over that. If I had these guys combined and then tried to lower the intensity, my ground would look okay, but then my rocks wouldn't really give me that, wouldn't give me the correct value I need for my normal map. So now that we have these two normal maps here, we can utilize this normal combine node. And so here I'll hit the space bar and I'll start to type in normal, and you can see that, you know, we've got a lot of utilities for working with normal maps, and normal combine here is what I used. So, you know, I put normal 1 and 2 into the inputs, and here for the technique I used the channel mixer high quality setting here to just mix these guys together. And here's the combined normal map that I get. And here for this normal map, you can see that this guy's 16-bit at this time, and so here we're just going to output this guy 16-bit. This will actually get demoted to 8-bit once we're inside of Unity, but I'm not doing any of the processing here towards the end. I'm just outputting this again because, like I said, all of these maps that we're working with from this node on are all 8-bit. So you know we're still optimizing our processing here at that stage. So here we have our rocks, and I'm utilizing another normal combine here. And so let me talk a little bit more about this noise that we see here. So like I said, I'm not just feeding my rocks straight into this guy. I actually have another noise here in place. And let's take a look at what I've done here. So this was just kind of an extra noise that I wanted to add to this guy that we haven't fully discussed yet. So this noise here, again, just more grayscale noise, is really serving the same purpose of the nodes that we've created up here. It's just creating just you know a lot of surface variation here for our dirt ground. So again, it's just another node structure. So what I did was I took this grunge map here, and I like these kind of wavy lines, and this gives me kind of a really nice pattern here to my ground, and you know gives me kind of like this nice kind of bumps, little mounds here across the ground, and nice streaking. So it almost looks like maybe you know there was some water that could have you know rush down through the surface or so on. And so, you know, I've got these small like little grooves in the ground. And so what I did was I took this map and I wanted to invert it. And so I used the levels here. Now, actually, this is probably not a good idea to do this. Let's check this out. So what I could do on this node here, let's just copy and paste this guy. And so here, this is the noise that I have. There's actually an invert on here. So if I just click this, I get the invert. So I actually missed that before. So you want to be careful again, like I said, you know, use, you know, only the nodes that you need. So here I'm using another node to process something, which is taking computation time up here in my graph. And, you know, I don't need that. So here, we're going to grab this guy and I'm going to connect him into that transform. And so here's the effect that we're getting right now. Let's take this and let's just hit invert. and this gets me right back to where I was. So here I can go in and just remove this node. Now I'm utilizing this transform because I just wanted to tile this. So here, here's what I have here for the noise, and then here is the transform itself. And so what I can do here is if I come over to this transform and I hit divided by 2, you can see this just tiles that noise. And so, you know, this is what we're getting now. So here I'm just utilizing this transform here just to tile that noise. And then, like I said, we're going to vary this. So instead of just having these real kind of these lines like this, I grabbed hold of this grunge map. This is a good grunge map because it has some of these kind of cracks and a lot of this kind of detail here into it. And here, we'll come back to this line in a minute because I'm actually compositing that near the end. So let's take a look at what I did here first. So like I said, black and white noise to kind of start with a bass. That's usually what I'll do. Start with just kind of a bass noise. Ran a levels on it to get, you know, just a really contrasty type map. And then I grabbed hold of this noise here, which is actually another dirt. This is dirt 1. So you can see the type of, you know, noise that this creates. And then I'm taking the maps here and I'm just doing a max lighten to get this type of effect here. So, you know, just kind of building this up. And then finally, I'm going to combine this map with this map. So if we take a look at our blend node here, you can see I'm using a multiply and I just drop the opacity here to get something like this. And finally, once I have that, we can go back to kind of the wavy line noise that we had here, and we're combining these guys here with an add linear dodge and then just dropping the opacity down. So this ends up becoming the noise that I created. So once I had this noise here, I created a normal map out of it. So that's what this normal map looks like. And here I have an intensity exposed. Let me take a look at this. Yeah, this is a parameter that I decided not to use. So I'm actually just going to get rid of this here. Let's go back to this intensity and I'm going to clear this. So we're going to keep this at 1. Now, like I said here, this is just a little bit noisy for this. So let's just take this intensity value and just drop it down. So maybe something more like this here. And so here I'm taking this noise and the rocks here and combining those guys together to get this. And then we have our other noise that we had that's creating these types of patterns with this normal, and we're going to combine these guys to get even more variation here in the normal map. See, a lot of these kind of cracks and areas like that are being generated here from this normal map. So you can see that we just, in the process of creating this normal, it just came down to the process of a lot of variation. We had just a bass ground noise. I had another variation of that ground noise mixed in with some pebbles here to create this overall normal map effect. Now, I want to start talking about the height information. So one of the things that I did here from this noise was I utilized this normal to height node, which is going to generate kind of a height pattern here for me. And so just as I covered in another video where we wanted to break out the rocks, because when I'm utilizing my scale for my material, so let's go to Materials, Default, Edit, and here you can see that my scale, if I'm using a high scale value here, I didn't want the rocks to just be, you know, displacing, you know, straight up at a very intense value. So I needed to separate that. And so, yeah, we covered this in one of the previous videos, and I'm just reusing this technique here. So here we're taking our rocks, and we're taking our height here. Now, the height that I'm using here is not this full normal. So notice that in this case, I'm not utilizing a lot of this detail. So some of this high frequency detail is being utilized in the normal map itself. So another kind of rule that I tend to follow is that I try not to put too much high frequency detail in my height map, because the height map is basically, you know, just giving us, in our case with what we're using in the shader, this parallax effect. So it's almost like we're using it to kind of create the overall silhouette and then of the object, you know, and then, or the, you know, the overall feel of shape. And then the normal map itself is where all the kind of the high frequency detail comes in. So if we try to, like, you know, use a height map to displace a lot of high frequency detail like this, it's just really not going to go well. So that's why I try to separate these guys. And so here we have our height. Now the reason why I use the height here is because I wanted to have these mounds. So here in my height at a base level, and here we have our rocks on top. Actually, it looks more like it's actually this one here. Here we have our rocks. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm just coming in here into this node and I'm blending the rocks and the ground together. And so I'm just using the copy mode. So I'm putting A over B, or basically foreground over background, and I'm driving it based on this opacity mask. So here I have a levels control. So what I did was I just took my rocks and needed to make a mask out of this. So I just grabbed a levels node and just pulled my input white down just to kind of make this, pretty binary black and white here for a mask. And this opacity is letting me drop the value of the rocks, so basically the foreground. So what I'm doing here, you can see if I start to increase my opacity, notice what we get here with our rocks. And this is what I was trying to avoid with this. So I'm using a pretty high scale value there in my material. And once we get into Unity, when we look at our height channel, we have a value that allows us to intensify the overall effect. And I wanted to avoid having a problem like this, where we have a really nice, setting for our scale on our actual ground, but the rocks are being driven really high. So that's why I always break out things like this when I'm adding pebbles. So I want to be able to control this separately. So here I'm just dropping that height down on the rocks, so basically the value of the rocks, so that at that specific height setting here, I can get a good blend of the height value that I need for the rocks and the ground itself. And so this is the height map that I get, like I was saying. And then we just output this here to height. Now, one thing I would like to try to experiment with here is being able to maybe change up the way I'm working with this height information. So one of the things that I'm a little concerned with just by looking at this is in this node here that I'm using to generate my height from for that ground, is there is a lot of noise in this. So maybe what I want to do is utilize this one here, which is a bit more clean. So let's try this. I'm going to hit the space bar and I'm going to create a normal, and I'm just going to take this and generate a normal map from this guy. So this is what we get, and I'm utilizing this here so I can change the value that I'm using for that normal to height. I still want to use this guy to feed up to my normal map, but I want a more clean version here for my height. So let me just plug this here into my height and look at the value that I'm getting. So here is the height, and let's look at how it's mixing in with our rock. Kind of the streaking line pattern here is a bit too intense, so what I'm going to do is just come back over here to my normal and just drop the intensity of this guy. And I think this is going to give me a better result for what I want to do. So I'm going to leave it like this now, because like I said, my height, I want to be, a bit more kind of clean like this. I don't want a lot of high frequency detail when I'm trying to displace here with my height. I'm going to leave that high frequency detail information to the normal map itself. So here's our normal. It's basically the same as my height minus a lot of this high frequency detail. And I think this is going to give me an overall cleaner result. So let's make that change. So while we're here talking about height, I just utilized this height information here to create my actual ambient occlusion. So from the height, we can grab our ambient occlusion node. So if you hit the space bar and you start to type in ambient occlusion, we have a node here that allows us to generate ambient occlusion. And so here you can see that I just used this node. I've got options here for my spreading and so on. And I'm just using this node here just to generate some ambient occlusion information here for my shader. And here, if we just back out here in our 2D view so we can actually see, I'm using this levels node just to demote this ambient occlusion down to 8-bit. So this node internally works at 16-bit, and here I'm just demoting it down to 8-bit. Because I don't need to feed in 16-bit information here into the actual shader input. So in this case, I'm just going to keep it this way, 8-bit, and then I'm going to just output this ambient occlusion as 8-bit. My height information, since I'm still working with this inside of Substance Designer, I'm leaving this at 16-bit, and I'm leaving my normal map at 16-bit. Now, the last thing we need to cover is the actual, colorization here of our material. So, like I said, we have, this map here that I was using for my overall ground. And I'm feeding that here into a gradient map. And so, since I typically work this way where I start with all grayscale values, like I said, I'll always utilize basically a node like this here. This gradient map allows me to kind of plot some keys, which basically remaps the range. If we just back out, well, here, let's do this. It remaps the range of this grayscale input based on these keys to produce this color image. And if I click the gradient editor button, I can just come in and just plot some keys and just change the value. So I'll select the key and just set a value. And this is all just completely visual. I'll just sit here, I'll look at my 2D view, and I'll just plot some keys, try some colors. Here you can see if I start to move the actual key, it'll start to change the overall value, which we're not actually looking at. Here, let's double click this map here. So for instance, if I just like completely change the color, you can see that, you know, it's basically taking whatever grayscale value is at the position. If we look at this gradient here is a tonal range of the grayscale input. Whatever values are around this position, we're going to map it to this color and so on. So here I'll just Control Z to undo that. And so like I said, I just plot some keys, some different colors, just visually move these keys around until I get, you know, something that, you know, looks like the overall color that I want to work with. And so here's the gradient map that I got with that. Now I did the same thing here for my rocks. And notice here my rocks is a real simple gradient. So I fed in my actual rocks here and just remap those values. Actually, I could have just double clicked the input. Remap those values here, so we got kind of like a dark gray and kind of a mid. This is going to be like the highlight area for the kind of the top rocks, and then, you know, just basically remap that tonal range to get, you know, this kind of coloring here. And then I came in and just blended these two guys together with the copy mode. So when I'm using copy mode, I'm trying to say I'm putting you know, the foreground over the background, and I'm going to drive it by this mask here. And so in this case, I just, again, reused this node here. Now, I didn't utilize this level mask. So remember earlier when I talked about, you know, having to blend my heights, I used like a more kind of binary, you know, black-white mask here. And I found that by using this mask, it gave me just a bit more kind of a hardness to the color blend. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's take this mask and plug it here into the mask input. And so here we'll look at our surface, and you can see that it just automatically it just looks more procedural. You know, you can see that the color value ranges for the rocks and stuff like that, it almost looks like they're just copy and pasted on top of our ground surface. And so I didn't want to do that. So that's why I utilized just the actual map I used from the height, because there's a lot of variance in the luminance. And so here, let's just reconnect this guy. So we'll take this guy and put this into the output. Now just keep your eye on the 3D view and you can see the change. So this here just gives more of a subtle effect. It almost looks like, you know, maybe some of the rocks here, some of the dirt is kind of collecting on top of the rocks. It just gives me an overall blend here. And I'm kind of getting that for free just because of my height map has these luminance values built into it like this. And that's why I went with that route. So here we have our color with our rock. This becomes our albedo. And finally, we're just outputting this guy here. That's going to cover this dirt ground material. In the next video, we're going to take a look at all of the graphs that we have been creating, and we're going to composite those together into our main rocky ground material that we're going to use in Engine.